Hello and welcome to the EMS Handoff podcast. This is David, and along with my co-host Eric McCullough and Bradley Dean, we are your source for all things EMS. And tonight we can truthfully say we have distinguished guests. And the only reason we can say that is because we're talking about ourselves. And as long as you talk about yourself positively, that's great. But tonight it's just us talking. So we're going to have a lot of fun stuff. Those are on the video. Going to catch us with some screen share and some content that's out there. If you're on the audio side, we're going to describe some of it, but we're going to have a little bit of fun with this, just the three of us. It's been a long time. Actually, I think it's since the very first episode of our Tidbit reboot that it was just the three of us. So going to have a little bit of fun. So before we get started, though, let's see how everybody is doing. Let's see. Paper, rock, scissors. We're going to North Carolina first. Let's Bradley Dean.
Hey, beautiful today. A little bit of rain earlier, but this weekend's great. So spent just a little bit of time outside this past week and weekend, but we also had classes inside, so we had to pull everybody back in since the weather was nice.
Of course, you had to pull everybody inside because it's nice. You only go outside when it's not. You know, that's the way. That's just the way it goes. So we're going to go over to Nashville next. Eric McCullough.
It's been awesome. It's been okay. So yeah, the weather's been a lot nicer and stuff here. I am currently waging a war against two squirrels that are contending for stuff in my garden. I'll let y'all know how that turns out. I have my son. I've kind of commandeered my son for it. He's 6. I don't think he's that effective against them, but way more effective than my dachshund.
So I just, Eric saying I could see him spreading on the green and black paint, putting on the BDUs again, and low crawling through the.
I would totally do it.
Machete.
I have a blood oath against those two things. Yes, I don't want. I feel like they're the same squirrels from last year. Probably aren't, but I'm just going to assume they are because they're eyeing some stuff in my garden. I don't want them to. I don't want them to be around it.
Oh my! They're back there plotting, Eric. They're going.
Oh, I know. I know. With the bunnies, with the rabbits.
Well, I'm going to say, I'm going to take a moment and a little dad pride here. Got to spend a little time this weekend with our daughter. It's a first child going through high school. Absolute wonderful experience this weekend, getting to see her graduate. I'm sure the tears will be coming, but we were overjoyed this weekend. I did have to say that we crushed the hopes and dreams of our son at the same time while we were standing on the floor of the graduation ceremony. He goes, "Well, guess I'm next." Well, yeah, no, really, son, you're not. And he's like, "What are you talking about?" I said, "Well, Alyssa will probably be done with her undergrad before you get done with high school." And it was one of those that you just crush that spirit. It's like, nice. Oh man.
Don't let them get too big headed first. Like, no, actually.
No, it's not going to happen. Yeah, so that's what we had this weekend. Today we celebrated her in a party that. Little graduation celebration. So it's always a nice thing. But she's going to grow up and move away about 45 seconds that direction to the university. But she is moving out of the house. It just so happens that move-in day is on her 18th birthday. Gotta absolutely love that. What kind of great day. So, all right, before we get started, and we're not even going before we introduce our guests. You already have all three of us right here. We would like to thank our podcast partner, the Journal of Emergency Medical Services. Jim's has been a great partner since starting this Tidbits reboot and the EMS Handoff. While EMS Handoff serves as your source for all things EMS in the podcast verse, Jim's has been an industry leader for many years. Make sure to go by their website and check out their efforts to keep the profession informed. And also go out and check all of our previous episodes as well as our podcast co-hosts that are out there for the different episodes that they host. And don't forget to go to their podcast sources, Apple, Google, and Spotify. What I will tell you is I am waiting on the delivery of our brand new EMS Handoff t-shirts. If you haven't in a while, make sure to go by the Pursuit Company, pursuitoutfitters.com/EMS Handoff. You see our brand new Keep Back 500 Feet podcast is live. T-shirts, new logo on the front, just to have a little bit of fun, going very similar to our EMS cohorts out in the field. Great thing. So make sure to go by and check them out. Bradley, normally I turn it over to you to introduce our guests. We've already introduced ourselves, so we just need to get into this topic. Let's go.
All right. Well, before we get started, everybody grab your drinks.
There it is.
So a toast to David. No wonder you were slurring your words, David. So you
Water.
mix water and the
water.
But that brings us to our topic. So it's real easy to get things kind of mixed up sometimes, and we have no idea what really happens sometimes in the back of our ambulance with patients and with things until it's all over, and then we realize that somebody may have given the wrong medication. So getting things switched and having an issue. So let's move right into the topic real quick, and I'm going to work to share my screen as we talk about and walk right through this, and hopefully everybody can see that.
Which, if you don't see this, because you're driving down the road and all that stuff, well, don't start watching YouTube right now. But it will be on YouTube. You can check it out later on there. I'll also probably have this up on the website so you can see it there too.
Right, and all this will be shared so everybody can have access to it, because it's a very important topic. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk a little bit about medication administration cross-checks, because everybody works with their patients, and we've got to do something to reduce medication errors. So really, is there a process, especially when we start looking at stuff with these patients, that everybody work now I'm slurring my words.
Are you having a stroke?
Water, Bradley.
Yeah.
Water.
Yeah. So especially a non-punitive process, to report these errors. Usually everybody's afraid to report them because they're afraid they're going to get in trouble. Well, in some cases, there should be some punitive action based upon not following particular policy or something else. But we'll get into how to look at it and get to the root of those errors in just a little bit. But the frequency of medication errors really is unknown when we look at everything that happens in the back of an ambulance. In a study done by Dr. Sabina Braithwaite, she looked at this, and 66% of pediatric doses were found to be completely wrong in one study, because people were having difficulty calculating and looking at the medication and being able to figure out exactly how much they were supposed to give. And sometimes they can figure out the milligrams, but then they couldn't figure out the number of milliliters to put with that. So, while we're talking about this, I asked Eric before we got started, but do you allow students to use calculators in the classroom?
Yes.
Yeah.
So,
now, that is a fundamental shift, and I'll go ahead and make mention of that. I remember going through myself, and believe it or not, one of the faculty members that works for me now was actually my instructor then. And at that point in time, everything was done by hand. And some of these things that I'm going to mention throughout tonight go along with that. But really, we take a fundamental shift in how things are done, and especially with the prevalence. Back when we first started, calculators weren't prevalent. And not everybody carried a little TI-83 with them all the time. But now we all have calculators with us. And I think that's a tremendous thing, but that's just me.
Right. No. Now, back when I was in teaching over the programs that I had, I'd always allow calculators, mostly because the National Registry allowed it, and that's what we tested against. But when it came to doing the math, yes, and me and Bradley were talking about this, he'll probably go into how the process is important, but I also thought using your aids is important too, as a good cross-check and stuff. So I never had a problem with using calculators.
Yeah, when I first started, the whole thing was you had to do everything by hand. You couldn't use calculators. Well, Now everybody's got a calculator either in their back pocket, on their side, or somewhere, because they'll pull out a phone and use the calculator, piece of that. I don't know very many. I did see one today in a class that has a flip phone. Even most flip phones now have calculators. So, being able to do that really should make things a little bit easier. And, it's well known that drug dosing errors occur throughout hospital-based healthcare systems at a rate of, 1 to 11%. But we really don't know what the prevalence is in EMS, because honestly, I think it's underreported. So when you look at the 2017 Institute of Medicine report, it says 18 to 28% of persons seeking healthcare were exposed to a medication error. That is a huge number. So one out of 4 to 1 out of 5 patients were exposed to some type of a medication error. And so when you look at that a little bit closer, it says, they were administered the wrong medication dosage, 28%, received the wrong medication from a physician, 18% of the time. So when we start looking at that disparity there, it's across all healthcare spectrums as far as the providers, whether it's a respiratory therapist, a nurse, physician, or someone else giving that medication. So when we really dive into that and we start looking at what Johns Hopkins released in the British Medicine Journal, it's about 250,000 deaths per year that are due to medical errors. That's the equivalent of over 400 747s crashing in a year with no survivors. That's 2 a day, 1 every 15 hours. If any other healthcare profession had the rate of deaths per year, they would get shut down. If the airline industry actually crashed 400 747s every year, they would be shut down by the government.
Well, if you take a look at it, just here recently, with the Boeing Max 8 aircraft that ended up having 2 crashes, and that entire platform was placed on the ground until they could figure it out and retrofit with redundant sensors, and that was 2 aircraft.
Yeah, and we still don't dive in and find out why these medication errors happen. Now, this probably doesn't even include a lot of the stuff that we look at with EMS, because, like I said, I think it's underreported. And medical mistakes they're human mistakes committed within a human system that's inadequately designed to catch and neutralize these mistakes. We are human, and every system is perfectly designed to get the results it consistently achieves. So if you've never read the book or looked at it, there's a book by John Nance, Why Hospitals Should Fly. Really breaks down in there the human mistakes and why errors happen.
There's another book, and I'm sure you guys have come across it, and some of our listeners probably have come across it, Checklist Manifesto by Dr. Atul Gawande. It's an amazing book I know he's covering the ICU. Mostly his book is about the ICU, but they go into medication errors and using checklists, which I'm sure we'll talk about even in just a few minutes further. But that's another book that I think everybody should at least have some knowledge about.
Yeah, and I'll say that wonderful book. I'm a huge fan of checklists, which we'll talk a little bit about. But checklists really allow us to be able to go through it. But I will say that the checklist is no good if you don't consistently use it. And that's the other piece. You've got to train with that checklist to be able to make sure that everything works. So when we look at the spectrum of medication errors, it's everything from wrong dose, wrong drug, route, wrong rate, wrong concentration, given to a patient despite the whole thing that they've got a documented allergy, or maybe there's a drug interaction because we didn't catch what the patient said or asked them. So James Reason actually published something called Human Error Models and Management in the British Medicine Medical Journal. And when you look at his Swiss cheese model, basically Swiss cheese has these holes in it. And when, poor design procedures, management decisions, and then, active errors, when those holes line up, it becomes a patient safety incident. And you're probably going, well, what does management decisions have to do with it? Well, we're going to take a look at some of that here and just kind of look at stuff, because over the last few years, we've had drug shortages, we've had inability to get drug concentrations, we've had inability to get things packaged in a consistent manner. So we may have pre-filled vials or syringes one day, and we have to order things in vials the next day. And then, we've got to package and put medications in appropriate spaces because we have limited space on an ambulance. So from one system, the question here is it a faulty system? There are two medicines here. What are those two medicines that you see?
One's morphine, one's lorazepam.
Right. One's morphine, one's lorazepam. One has to be refrigerated, the other one doesn't. But because of limited space, and if you're looking at maintaining shelf life, what's the best thing to do?
Tackle box, dry, cool place.
Right. Dry, cool place. So we take all of the controlled medications, we want to put them in the same spot, so we create a refrigerator that's got a lock on it. And we put them all in that refrigerator. So now they're all packed in this little box that you see over on the right-hand side of the screen. But what do we notice about lorazepam and morphine?
They're both orange. And let me tell you, if you have any sort of color blindness or you have any sort of stress whatsoever where you're having to get the lorazepam in a rush, I can see you making that mistake pretty easily, especially around 1 a.m.
Right. So these two medications in some units were actually packed side by side. So, very easy to make a mistake when you look at this. Granted, I look at it, I go, one's got a blue top, one's got an orange top. One's got orange writing with white letters. The other one's got white label with orange lettering.
Yeah, but you know what? Like, I'm sure we've all been at the fire hall at EMS stations when we hear of a medication error, and we're always like, I don't know how they could get that wrong. Don't they? You just read the thing as if like we are so much better than that we would not make those same errors. When really, in an emergency, when your amygdala is more lit up than your prefrontal cortex is, your higher order thinking skills, and you're looking at those two vials and you don't know. I mean, yeah, it takes 2 seconds to look and make sure it's the right drug. And maybe 99.98% of the time you get it right, except for that one time when you had like a new partner who thought they were grabbing the lorazepam and you took it for granted and you just gave it to them anyways, and they started drawing it up or something. That's when you start mixing the problems, I think.
Right. And keep in mind that storage and labeling are mitigation processes. Okay. We still have to have active processes to catch errors. So, even if you put these in two separate boxes, you can still make that mistake. That's a mitigation to this instead of having them in the same box. But you're also limited with the amount of space. So having these in the same box, we've got to look at, all right, so they are labeled different. You should be able to read the labels, but we still have to have another active process, which we'll talk about in just a minute. 2 additional medications. What are these? Or can you identify these?
I have no idea. That's a good one.
I'm going with one of them being Benadryl.
Oh, it's interesting. Benadryl doesn't come in blue where I'm at. That's interesting.
Right. And so I didn't even add Benadryl into this picture, but it's very similar as well. So when you look at these very similar vials, slight size difference if you actually were to hold them in your hand, but they both got blue tops. One's a darker blue than the other one. So when we look at them,
oh man,
yeah. So one's Zofran or Ondansetron, and the other one's atropine. Slight size difference, but there again, with medication shortages and continually changing how medication is packaged, it may lead to a medication error.
That's why you don't tell people grab the blue drug.
but we all remember it. Going back to the day, give me instead of giving a box of atropine because you may have been asking your EMT for it. It's like, give me this box or give me that box, and you relate it by the color. And as we're seeing, that's not always necessarily the case, and certainly have to have a checks and balance with it as well.
Right. Brown box, purple box, pink box. Does anybody remember what color beryllium was?
Orange. Dark orange.
So beryllium was depends on which one it came from. It's either dark orange, and sometimes it was like a dark gray. So.
Oh, okay. Yeah, might have been dark gray too.
Again, is it a faulty system? Because they're packaged in the drug box side by side. Because it's where they fit. So this is what I'm getting at by other latent decisions, management decisions, or logistics makes a decision that, hey, this is the only thing I can get. I'm going to order this. Now we've got to add some syringes so we can draw up the atropine because we can't get it in a pre-filled syringe. So there are lots of things that we have to look at whenever we're, ordering and buying and packaging medications. Because if somebody mixed up these two medications, I could certainly see how that happened in the back of the truck. By the way, atropine will work for nausea. But I wouldn't.
Yeah. Oh. not a clinical recommendation.
So regardless of what we talk about on this podcast, always follow your local policies, protocols.
There we go. There's a legal disclaimer. David's happy now.
Wes, I was going to say Wes would be proud, but but as you mentioned, Bradley, this is actually very interesting because looking at it from the management side, whoever my logistics person is whenever this new product come in, the first thing that they should do is recognize that, hey, this is different than what we've been traditionally receiving. And, oh, by the way, it looks really close to this. And this would be something that I would think would be highly encouraged to send out to all the crews and say, hey, we've gotten a new Hyundai Encitron, or a new atropine or a new this or new that. And it comes in and you have to be very cautious about, mixing these up.
And to point something else out. So if you look at the other atropine that's beside it, and of course it's expired if you're looking at it relative to today's date, but the top on it was gray. And there again.
That's a good point.
Yeah, it's a milligram of atropine. So consistent packaging doesn't happen anymore based upon the manufacturer. So could these two bottles get mixed up?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Well, the mitigation strategy was to put the nasal spray between them.
Yeah, which I could see people wrestling around these bags, and that wouldn't be the divider for very long.
So the next question is, can you identify those medications by looking at the top of the bottle?
Ibuprofen, and then the other one is, I have no idea. Maalox? I have no clue.
No, that's what we carry in our personal bags.
Yeah.
So when you look at these two, one is actually Benadryl, the other one is Tylenol or acetaminophen. Very similar packaging. Both are pink in color. We're not always operating in ideal light conditions. They both have small print. Of course, the one in the clear bottle is the diphenhydramine. The one on the right is the acetaminophen. So, but could those two get mixed up? Sure. But how do we prevent these errors? So we've got to look at and start thinking about more ways to research how to stop errors from reaching patients because, we're human. Errors were still going to happen. but we've got to design a system to kind of trap those errors to make sure that Swiss cheese, the hole doesn't go all the way through it. And, I'm not sure if it was James Reason or somebody else. They said, if you look at a block of Swiss cheese and the hole goes all the way through it, don't eat it because the mouse has already been there. So the holes shouldn't go all the way through. There should be some layer of something to actually stop that error from reaching the patient. So we've got to research the why and how errors happen. And those are the key to decreasing errors. So research as to why they occur and what process is there to reduce the error. So let's talk about root cause analysis for just a minute. And this doesn't go into anything that's in this particular presentation, but I don't care who the provider is. I don't care who their partner was. I don't care what was wrong with the patient. I want to know the why and how that error occurred. So usually what I do is that when I, if I'm talking to a crew or, somebody calls me and says, hey, we had a medication error, where you come to our system and look at it, one of the first thing I ask is what happened. I want the crew member to tell me exactly what happened. They can explain all the patient stuff they want to me, but what happened? Then I'm going to ask them what normally happens. Okay. And then I want them to tell me, well, normally I pull this out and I do the 6 rights of medication administration. All right. And then what policies and procedures are in place? What do your policies and procedures require? And what I've found is most places, when you look at their policies and procedures, there's nothing in their policies, but they might have a procedure that says, medication administration, you should check the 6 rights of medication administration. It lists out the 6 rights. Who picks up and reads that policy every single time as part of that checklist? None of us.
Well, and this is one of my notes that I took down here is, and you kind of referenced it earlier, is why are we not utilizing our material? And I'm going back to something Eric said earlier when you asked about the calculators. And the fact is now National Registry allows you to use field manuals. And what I found funny is I don't know how many ERs I've been in, and when you go into some of the ERs that don't typically handle cardiac arrests very frequently, some of the smaller hospitals, one of the first things the physician does when he gets in there is comes out with his the handbook of emergency care, the little flip book, and goes into the algorithms and starts to look. And I remember back into my hazmat environment in which the first thing when you got to a hazmat scene was stopped, backed up, brought out your materials, figured out a plan, and moved forward. And why is it a badge of honor to say in EMS that we did everything from memory when we have a ton of stuff that's readily available? And, when I did work on the ambulance side and transport, I will tell you that, especially when it came to pediatrics, if I was bringing anything out of the medication boxes, my protocol manual was out there in front of me.
Yeah, you're right. We have kind of demonized the protocol manual as if like it's a badge of honor, like you said, to do medicine out in the streets the way that they do in the ER. But really, you're right. In the clinical setting, there's a little bit more time, there's more resources, and they have no problem using them. Like me and Bradley were talking right before we got on about the registry. And I said, I was an advocate of an EMT or a paramedic being able to come into the National Registry with a little flip book and being able to use that, because it doesn't make any sense. How come on the training end, we want you to use the aids, but on the testing end, no, don't use the aids. But then on the clinical practical aid, we're like, no, use the aids. So, and I get the whole like, well, we have to have a foundation of competency. I get that part, but that book will not do anything to help with your differential diagnosis or anything like that. And even if it did, that's great. I don't understand why we've become so resistant and hostile to it. And EMS, I think, is kind of alone in that. And I might be incorrect about that too.
Well, and one thing I'm going to go ahead and say there is we have given the open book test before. And guess what? Many of the individuals did worse on the open book test because they hadn't been in it and they didn't know where to go to find the information. And so they started struggling and going through. And if you have that material out, if you are training on it, and as much grief as I give you guys, the Air Force is very similar in a lot of ways. That before a plane takes off, there's a checklist that has gone through, because there's a very valuable piece of equipment on the other end of that. And then within that, there's several lives that are going into it. And so if we train with these things, if we drill with these things, granted, we need to have that base understanding. So one of Eric's Bradley's things that he had earlier was, making sure that we know that which disease process we're dealing with. So we're on the right plan, but know what our materials are, know how to use them, and do so efficiently and effectively.
Yeah, because there's another part of EMS that, sorry, Bradley, I keep probably talking right over you, buddy. But one thing that I have noticed working kind of in the clinical setting now, less so on the ambulance, I still work on the ambulance some, but not a lot, but I still work in the clinical, is that we're making a lot of autonomous decisions. Now, I'm not saying we're functioning as practical, like mid-levels or higher, but our critical thinking process, because yes, we have protocols, but it's ultimately our determination as to what protocols they're going to fall under. And if we get that incorrect, then we're going to get everything else incorrect. So yeah, you can have the memory aids and stuff all you want, but if you can't reason out the difference between pneumonia, costal chondritis, or appendicitis, things like that, if you can't reason that out and go through the right protocol, then your memory aid doesn't really do you much good anyways. And I would suggest that we're under a little bit more stress in the pre-hospital environment because the physicians are not seeing what we're seeing. They can't help make the decision for us. We're having to make a lot of strong and quality decisions that will impact patient outcome or can impact patient outcome, in the relatively near future.
Right. And so driving back to all this is, then one of the things I tell our AEMT and our paramedic students are, make your drug cards. And they're like, well, if we don't have to memorize all the medications, you're telling us not to memorize everything, why do we need to make the drug cards? Well, my response to that is it makes you get in the book or into the PDR. So when you're out in the field, you can quickly reference because you've already know how to look things up. And you may remember what you put on that drug card, quickly. But, and then, I try to drive back to this when I'm looking at a medication error is why did it happen? Did they not use the tools that were available? Did they not train with the appropriate tools to begin with? And then, what is the organization doing to manage that risk? Because if you work for an agency that is not working to manage that risk, you've got another problem.
Yeah, I agree with you about those drug cards. I do think it's a great way for them to know the stuff. I'll tell you, my squishy brain doesn't work as well as it used to. So what I have to do is I make these cards, and I don't know if we can see them. You can probably zoom in. I'll probably give a link to it. They're free. It's just a little template. But basically, it literally has this one has ketamine. It has the syringe size that I'm using on the side is weights. So I can estimate the weights and the milliliters. I even marked on the syringe how far up I go on the syringe, as well as the indications and contraindications. It's wrapped in shipping tape, and I put it on a little carabiner. So at 2:00 in the morning, I don't have to worry about, if I'm giving ketamine, I know my concentration. I can do my dose rather quickly. It's a tool for cognitive offloading, and I like using it for that reason because it at least bears the stress down a little bit.
Let me see if I can stop sharing the screen here and zoom into you.
Okay. Yeah, sure.
Spotlight you.
Yeah. I don't know if because my background makes it to where, there it is. Hey, there we go. All right. Yeah, there it is. So got my contraindications, concentration, my dose. And again, there's the weights. It looks backwards on mine. I don't know if it does there, but again, I'll put the link down in the thing. And I do the same thing for morphine just because I forget sometimes. And that's what these things are for. They're for in case you forget. I don't have a whole lot of these on there, so some of them have changed and I have to go back through them. goodness, I can't even remember what this one is. Oh yeah, like fentanyl. I got one for fentanyl. Not the best drawing, doesn't have to be, but I had to do it for fentanyl because we have 3 different reasons why we would give fentanyl. So this just makes my life a lot easier. So at 2:00 in the morning, I'm not having to think of anything. And heck, this serves as a really good cross check, just in case I'm with an AMT or medic. And I pull this sucker out. I'm like, all right, we're going to give this much fentanyl. And if someone's watching this, you're like, oh, that's so dumb. I know our doses and stuff. I'm like, well, good for you, but I don't trust myself at 2:00 in the morning. I'm barely able to get to the place. Now I got to critically think. It takes a minute. So this just kind of is a good way to cognitively offload for me, anyways.
Okay. So I'm going to go back to the screen here. There we go. So let's talk about hospitals for a minute. So routine hospital drug administration, different than pre-hospital. Physician enters the order in the computer for the patient. So the computer checks that entered weight, make sure it's appropriate. It calculates the dose and, checks against the child or the adult's, weight to assure it's right. Order goes to the pharmacist who checks the dose, mixes the medication. The drug is barcoded with the patient's name, drug dose. Pharmacy delivers that to the nurse. Nurse scans the drug, the patient's ID band. Scanner confirms right drug, right patient. The nurse double checks patient name and drug. Medication gets administered. So now we've gone through all of the rights of medication administration. Here's a sample screenshot of, basically one of the ways that it's done. A little bit of an older system there.
Well, and before we even go further there, I'm want to add another step, and I don't know if your alls do there, but you go into some of the pediatric hospitals, and not only is all of that done, but also there's a second nurse, and depending on what the medication is, even in adult hospitals, there will be a second provider that is verifying the chart, verifying the medication before it's ever given. So you have all of these steps up to now. We do know in the emergency department it's a little bit different because they do have the crash cart, but the thing is in their calculations or their post resuscitation or whatever the case is, they are collecting those boxes and validating what they administered in case there was something else that was given.
Right. So, what happens in the pre-hospital? Well, the paramedic determines the drug to be given. Paramedic calculates the dose, or the AEMT, with or without a computer. They may or may not consult the protocol. They may use the drug dosing aid. They may not. They draw up the dose or grab the prefilled syringe and boom, medication gets given. So where can these errors occur? Well, there's all kinds of places along the route that can occur. Calculation of the weight. Then you got to you got to convert from pounds to kilograms because we do a horrible job in elementary education of teaching our kids that kilograms are going to be needed for the rest of their life. Dose, that'll give us the milligrams. Then we got to calculate how many milliliters to be able to give that many milligrams, and then we got to give it to the patient. So a lot of us don't practice that. And we do all this under the most stress that some of us will ever be under. That sick, critical patient, poor working conditions because, it's cold or freezing outside, or we're soaking wet and families yelling at us. Now, on the screen, you will see something that will probably look familiar to a lot of people. Why did that aircraft end up there and everybody live?
Because Tom Hanks is an amazing pilot.
So
Tom Hanks.
Yeah. So I can say I actually flew flight 1549 days before this incident actually occurred. So Sully Sullenberger's from Charlotte and routinely flew back and forth. But checklists. He had routinely used those checklists in training. He was able to use those checklists and start the process quickly as he was walking down through that. So the question is how much of what we do is really time sensitive, time critical? Well, airway, breathing, circulation. If you can't oxygenate and ventilate a patient without using, a checklist, then that's probably an issue. If you can't put on a tourniquet or stop bleeding without using a checklist, that's probably an issue. For everything else, the patient needs the right drug medication slower than they need the wrong medication faster. And, take that minute, use a checklist to make sure we're getting to the right patient to the right medication at the right time. And we can run through everything fairly simple. So a prime example would be pediatric dose of glucose, something very simple. The dose is 0.2 to 0.5 grams per kilogram. Well, we got to take their weight because mom knows what the kid weighs in pounds, not in kilograms. Okay. Now, I will say that Peter Antevi has a great system that's out there that takes a lot of guesswork out of the equation because he does a lot of pediatric stuff. But it depends on what your system has. You may have D25, D50, D10, D5, and then you got to figure out how many grams per milliliter is there. So then you got to do your calculation. So it can get really confusing. So with all these opportunities for error, can any of us get it right? Because correct medication and dose requires, a complicated string of events. And we may not experience, critical patients, in, the next 2 years. It's a high stress situation, as you mentioned. So we should have some aids such as checklists, drug charts, but those are still not perfect. So how do we fix it? Well, we should put some things in place to help reduce that. Our personnel don't have the tools needed to perform well with an infrequent event. So in the hospital, we've got computerized order entry, we've got pharmacist checks, we've got allergy flags. None of those are currently available pre-hospital. So that requires a change of our culture. So we've got to accept that we're human and we make mistakes. Errors need to be treated as a system failure, not a failure of the person that made the mistake. Now, the person may still have made a mistake because they blatantly disregarded something if it's been put in place. And errors need to be freely reported without repercussions so the system can be corrected. And we've got to look at it and see, is it truly a system issue or was it a provider issue? And we've got to design, things for EMS to decrease the incidence of medical errors.
And, speaking of which, you were talking earlier about the 5 rights that we look at, and we sometimes think that's the flag post, that's the post that we use to ensure efficacy. But there's a study that you and I were discussing before. It's medication safety in EMS, approaching an evidence-based method of verification of medications. And actually in there, in the work cited, you can see the efficacy of the 5 rights has never been evaluated or quantified. So if you're just saying, well, you're supposed to check the 5 rights, there's really no literature that reflects that that's the best and most effective way of ensuring patients' medication safety that way.
Right. And I actually mentioned that a little bit later here. And so, for example, in the system where I am, if somebody makes a medication error, they're probably not going to get in trouble for the medication error. They do get in trouble for blatant disregard of policies and procedures if they don't use the safety checks that are in place. That's what we need to get people to understand. If you have the safety checks and a process or a checklist, you need to use them. You need to train with them. You need to use them every time. That way, when it's a critical medication, you're able to walk through it without stumbling. So people get in trouble for not using the safety checks, not for giving the wrong medication, because it could be a system issue as well, because we saw how close some of those medications look to each other. And in the book I mentioned earlier, John Nance says, treat every drug administration if it's wrong, and it will kill the patient. So my recommendation to EMS agencies and personnel is re-examine packaging and storage of the medications and use a medication cross-check procedure and make it part of your culture. I need to find the actual study, but there was a study that evaluates the medication cross-check procedure that I'm getting ready to share with everybody. And then publish any packaging changes as soon as possible and identify any similarities to make medication names obvious. Like if you need to put a bigger label on it or put a label across the top of the vial.
And I think I have the study that you're referring to actually, and I'll put those in the show notes.
Okay. Yeah, because we know that there is evidence to support the medication administration cross-check. Now, it does utilize the rights of medication administration, but somebody forgets one of those as they're going through the process. But this medication administration cross-check doesn't allow you to forget it. So this is an active process. You can't look at it and do it passively. So if I draw up a medication, and let's say that I'm going to give a patient Zofran because of their nausea. So what I would do is, Eric, I would look at you and I would go, med check, and your response would be?
Ready.
So I'm going to give Zofran 4 milligrams IV for nausea.
Are there any contraindications?
There are no contraindications.
All right. So what's the volume?
So it's 2 milliliters. So then, I'm going to give Zofran 4 milligrams in 2 milliliters. And then I'm showing you the vial and the syringe.
And sounds good. Go for it.
So that way we have walked through everything. So, when you look down at it, and because you asked about the contraindications, so the contraindications include, verification of appropriate vital signs, any known patient allergies, expiration date, because I'm showing you that vial. If there's any discrepancy, any disagreement, or need or clarification, then stop. Only provider 2 can authorize the administration of the medication. So the medication cross-check must be completed prior to administration of any medication. And if there's any interruption or change in the patient condition, then everything should be stopped.
So I could see an issue with this already. If you're in a system where you're working with another EMT or AMT, you're going to have to make sure your partner is at least knowledgeable on the medications that you have, even if they can't administer it. This is why I was always like, and I'm sure you guys are too, I want EMTs and AMTs to know medications that are in the back of the ambulance, even though they have no power and no authority to administer it. This is why it's important, so that a paramedic can trust them to be like, okay, yes, this is, and to do this cross check.
Right. So let's look at this and take that one step further. So yes, it is great for an AEMT or an EMT to know what's carried on the unit that they're working on, but they can read a medication label. So when they ask that question of contraindications, that should trigger provider 1 to run back through, okay, the vital signs are good and there's no allergies, so it's an active process. But what if you're in the back of the truck by yourself and your EMT partner is driving? There's no reason you can't use the patient. I see nurses use the patient and say, hey, I'm going to give you this for your nausea. And whether nurses realize they're using this or not, they're using a medication administration cross-check. So it's an active process, whether it's with an EMT partner or the patient themselves. Even if the patient's unresponsive, in the back of the truck, I use the medication administration cross-check because it makes me actively think through the process.
I just like the accountability of it. And if you really think about it, the way that we're trained is so divergent from all other allied health or all other medical, like PA, nurse prac, physician, RN. If you really think about it, like our 2 tracks are so different because we rely so heavily to do hardcore, high operating medicine with such low accountability levels. Like we don't have PICSA systems in the ambulance, like you were pointing out. So we don't have any of those systems. So we're functioning. I mean, it's the Wild West. EMS that's why they call it the Wild West, is because we just don't have those systems of accountability that are consistent like they do in the hospital and clinical settings.
Right. And when we look at errors in EMS, I mean, medication errors is one little aspect. I mean, we have, skill-based errors, we have rule-based errors and knowledge-based errors. So skill-based errors, we perform the skill incorrectly because we didn't do the right skill, or we didn't use the right piece of equipment for that particular procedure. Rule-based errors, so we come up with rule-based solutions for those. That's why we use sample and OPQRST. And then we start looking at knowledge-based errors, then that's, wrong protocol selection that we were talking about earlier. So all of that has to factor in. So for those of you that are watching this, I think he's going to post, I think Eric's going to post this in the show notes, but this gives you a breakdown of the error type and different examples.
And it's never too early to learn this stuff or too late. There's another culture in our system too, where it's more senior medics, which in our field, it don't take long to become a senior medic, like 4 or 5 years before you're, kind of have a senior reign. That this is a complete culture change. And this isn't the softening of the next gen who they're not back in my day, blah, blah, blah. It's like, we have to remove this mentality that it's about us at all, because it's not. It's supposed to be about the patient. And if that means we need crutches and glasses and whatever to make us get better, then that's what we need to use. We need crutches and glasses, because it's kind of ridiculous that we can beat our chest and say how awesome EMS is and how we can do all this stuff. But if we're having these errors and we have people who are coming in and they're being brought up to have a completely different culture change, then we shouldn't be browbeating them about it.
Right. So, I mean, we need to encourage people to report errors so we can find system faults. And, the other piece of that is if they didn't follow the medication administration cross-check, they failed to follow a procedure. That is no different than continually being late to work on time, or, running through a red light and an accident happening. They failed to follow stopping at the stoplight. So this just runs through the different errors, category errors, and break down from the study that you were talking about earlier. But that can be taken and broken down into 3 basic things. So there was 3 classification of medical errors that I really break things down into is, error made, no harm to the patient, no change to the patient outcome. So the second one is error made, harm to the patient resulted. So harm comes in, varying degrees to the patient. So maybe they had, a reaction. You gave them atropine instead of Zofran because you grabbed the wrong vial. So now you made an error. Harm resulted to the patient because they had an increased heart rate and chest pain. Well, so that wasn't bad, but the patient didn't die. The last one is error made, and the patient died. So death resulted. A couple of memorable quotes. So as you mentioned earlier, straight out of that study, it says there is zero validation that the 5 rights, 6 rights, 7 rights, or 9 rights work to reduce medication errors. Use a medication administration cross-check for every medicine, every time. So some of the key takeaways, situations that make errors more likely include, disorganized workflow, interruptions and distractions, which happen all the time in EMS. Fatigue. Hopefully we'll talk about that on a future podcast, but we'll talk about fatigue in EMS. But, people working shift work get tired. Time pressure, because we stick to this whole thing. Well, you've got to be off the scene in a certain amount of time, and you've got to get this done in a certain amount of time. While there should be certain quality measures, we also sometimes need to take into account with a critical patient that we need to slow down, because slow is smooth and smooth is fast. high stress environment. So in other words, our workplace lends itself to errors. And how do we fix it? So we've got to create an environment that it's okay to disclose errors, not that we're afraid to report them. So adjust culture. And adjust culture doesn't mean, hey, buddy, everything's going to be okay. We know this happened, but everything's going to be okay. No, adjust culture means that we report it, we fix it, and if somebody didn't follow a particular policy or procedure, that may result in disciplinary action. We've got to identify certain behaviors. So if it is continually risky behavior, that's one thing. If it's reckless behavior, that's totally different. So identifying the risky behavior versus reckless behavior, and reckless behavior is not following policies and procedures. Use a medication administration cross-check, which is a simple standardized tool, and it is a two-person verbal procedure that contains intentional error traps. So we're making sure that those holes in the Swiss cheese don't go all the way through.
And you know what, like, if you're a teacher or instructor listening to this, like it probably wouldn't be a bad idea to print that checklist off, laminate it, put it in a sheet protector, and just have your students go through it, see what happens. You may decide, you may find out that they like doing this. They may find out all the stress kind of comes away from them, and that reduces the stress load in of itself, where they can look at a drug and be like, oh, nope, you grabbed the wrong dose. Let's do this dose instead.
And you're giving them a checklist up front. To reduce that, and it's something that they can carry to wherever they go to work. So we know that drug dosing errors occur everywhere. We're just giving you a simple tool, for those that are listening. We know that errors occur at a very high prevalence in the pre-hospital environment, but they're probably underreported. In some areas, they have infrequent critical patient exposures, infrequent practice of drug calculations, and lack of exposure and practice is a setup for errors to occur. When we've got to make sure that we're using similar medications whenever we're doing scenarios and teaching stuff in classes. Relabeling medications to use them in a classroom is not a good practice.
Now, back getting the color tops that's a really good idea, because you can change the color tops around if they're not paying attention and or going through a checklist. And I think that's another thing. This idea of just telling somebody to pay attention, to concentrate more, none of those isms, none of those pithy little things work. They will do it for class. They will do it because they're scared to fail. But then when they get out of there, we didn't actually equip them with any strategies going forward. We basically just equipped them to pass tests. And there are plenty of people out there in the medical field who are great at passing tests.
Oh, yeah. So I think all of us, as well as those, listening, watching on YouTube, now is the time to begin solving this problem for EMS. Look at your systems, look at what you've got. How can we stop these medication errors from occurring? Can you implement the medication administration cross-check in your system? It's not a hard process. You tell people to use it, you put it in your policies and your protocols, and there you go. It takes everybody involved to fix this. The problem is we've got to teach it in the initial education as well. And it requires, some creative thinking. So we've got to change the culture of blame and shame. Doesn't mean people don't get in trouble for things, but we've got to encourage them to report it so we can fix the system issues to mitigate the human error that occurs on the other side. So.
All right. Well, I think we have gone through and really, only hit the surface level of this, because as you said, Bradley, there's a lot of things that we can go into. We can go into the fact that sleep deprivation, multiple shifts, 24-hour shifts, running back-to-back calls, those kind of things. Those are all things that we can add on to this. So we just kind of hit that surface level. So make sure to use some sort of tool to help you. The checklist is a great addition, and I know just for me personally, I came really close to administering something wrong, but just reading everything out loud and as I was verifying it, realized it was wrong, made a change and was able to do it right. So it's definitely a good thing. So another great episode, and enjoy just the three of us. Just something we don't get to do very often. So hopefully everybody liked this, and just give us a shout out. And as we say at the end of every week, without your all's feedback, we don't know exactly what you're thinking. So make sure and go by our website at emshandoff.com. Eric has got a lot of great things going on there, but you can always reach out to us and let us know what you think. Don't forget to go buy Gems on Apple, Spotify, or Google, and give us a subscribe, rate, and review there as well, and help out our podcast partner, Gems. And don't forget to go check out whether you like the red shirts that Bradley and I have on, because Eric doesn't support the red. That's all right.
I like the black. I don't look good in red.
Well, it's sometimes, but you can also check out our new gear as well that just went live this last week. Go to the Pursue company at pursueoutfitters.com/EMS Handoff. Jeremy and his team there would love to get out some of the new shirts there. So on behalf of my co-host, Eric McCullough and Bradley Dean, this is David, and we'd like to say take care, stay safe, and always remember the value of your EMS handoff.